to, to Sophie Stenson. She's a student at Exeter University. She's studying sustainable governance with a particular interest in the UK's nature workforce and conservation volunteering. She has a master's degree in conservation science and policy and a bachelor's degree in zoology. She's combined her early career academic and field experiences to work on her passion for what is called a just conservation sector, which I'm sure she's going to tell us more about today. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Sophie. If you want to start.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so I'll try and get my first slide up here and then we can get started. There we go. Can everyone see that? I can't see anyone anymore, so if anyone give me a
yeah, that's fine.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. Yeah, so thank you so much to the Academia Special Interest Group for me to present my work this evening, and thank you all so much for taking the time to attend today. My research focuses partly on sustainable governance, but today I'll mainly be focusing on the UK's nature workforce and the motivations and barriers for participation in nature recovery. So my PhD is supervised by Dr. Oliver James and Dr. Lewis Elliott at the University of Exeter within the wider Renew project and in partnership with Natural England. So I thought I would start with a little introduction about myself and how I got into this work to set the scene. Now, I'm sure many of you in the audience are familiar with this quote. So only when the last tree has died and the last river been poisoned, fish caught, will we realise we cannot eat money, which is attributed to the Cree and North American Indigenous people from an area which is now part of Canada. And my dad, who recently retired, but was a biology and environmental sciences teacher for over 40 years, used to have this poster on the door to his classroom. And I remember seeing the quote regularly from a young age and thinking about its significance. So it's no mystery where my pro-environmental values came from. And it's interesting to look back at this for me, to think about just my time and career so far I've spent thinking about this very issue. So growing up with an interest in environmental and well, in the environment and particularly in wildlife, I decided to study my bachelor's degree in zoology at the University of Edinburgh. And at the time, I also took a year in industry abroad to study whale sharks in Mexico and to rehabilitate sloths in Costa Rica. And these are just some of the photos from those jobs. So I was incredibly lucky. And as part of my job managing a wildlife sanctuary in Costa Rica, I used to care for all of the animals in the sanctuary with permanent injuries. I would assist the vet with cases that came in with tree debris, and I'd also train all of the volunteers in animal care. And as exciting and fascinating as these jobs were, I really struggled with the feeling that I could never achieve enough change by addressing only the symptoms of human-wildlife conflict. So on a daily basis, I actually found it really exhausting physically and emotionally as well, trying to help an endless stream of animals arriving at the centre, confiscated from the illegal pet trade, that had been executed or hit by cars because of expanding urban areas. And whilst I was overcome by the compassion and enthusiasm in people from all life, volunteering their sweat and tears and also their holidays to helping these animals, I couldn't ignore the irony that it was human-wildlife conflict that was causing both animals and the people to be there in the first place. So I'm hoping this next slide will work. I've got a short video here and I apologize for the camera skills. They're not great as I was using my other hand as well. But this is a two-toed sloth called Miss Donut, and I didn't name her, but unfortunately she was climbing along an electrical cable to get across the road and got electrocuted, dropped onto the road and was hit by a car. And it was a while before anyone noticed her and actually called us to come and help. So you can see the large abscess from the injury on her right side and a scar across her head. And unfortunately, her back legs were actually paralyzed after the accident. So, you know, what's the right thing to do here? Should we treat her? Should we euthanize her? Do we keep her in the sanctuary, release her? This wouldn't stop more Miss Donuts from arriving at the centre, though. So should we protect the area she naturally lives in and ban people from access? Or maybe we work with local electrical companies to design covers for electrical boxes to reduce the chance of electrocution. And it's through experiences like these that I became more and more interested in the role of humans in these conflicts, and the people carrying out the conservation work as a result, kind of turning my attention more towards the social sciences. So after returning to the UK to complete a master's degree in conservation science and policy, I'm now completing a PhD in sustainable governance, where my days are filled with questions like, sorry, that should be the next one. There we go. What is our society's relationship with nature like? How can we maintain or improve that relationship? And how is that reflected in policy and governance? So what do I mean by sustainable governance? Well, the IUCN define sustainable governance as the set of written and unwritten rules that link ecological citizenship with institutions of norms and governance. Norms of governance. So we should aim to have a real balance between the traditionally prioritized economy, the environment, and social justice to achieve a sustainable system. Now, I suspect everyone here is familiar with why we might need sustainable governance, considering the global climate, environmental, and biodiversity crises. But sustainable governance also concerns itself with this transition. It has to be fair for people too. So at the intersection of economics, politics, ecology, environmental psychology, ethics, and so many other aspects, sustainable governance covers a broad subject area which requires interdisciplinary work. Now, the good news is, since around about the 70s, there's been increasing studies that have recognised some of these overlaps, like the importance of human connections with nature for our health and well-being. You know, sure, we get oxygen from trees and physical fitness from walking in the woods, but we also have a psychological need for nature for our mental health. And we actually heal faster in hospital rooms with views of natural features. Other studies have also shown that views of nature reduce violence and crime in otherwise troubled neighbourhoods and evenings as well. And sadly, these interactions are now lacking because we're living in sterilised and nature-poor environments, where a healthy environment is actually less valued than economic growth. In a system that doesn't properly value nature and the importance of human-nature connections, we lose these health and well-being benefits. So, okay, great. You know, we need green spaces, we need parks, we need urban greening, we need the native birds and bugs and biodiversity. So how do we do that? Or rather, who is going to do that? You know, we need people who understand the environment, yes, but we also need people who understand people too. And one of the problems is that the current system has very little support and funding for the people that carry out environmental work. And sadly, that's no big news to anyone in the environmental sector. But studies now actually show that this is in crisis. One of Saim's reports is a great example of that. And it points out that there are skill shortages and gaps. There's reliance on volunteers and voluntary contributions. And the environment sector is second least diverse in the UK, only after farming, suggesting that there are accessibility issues. And this has created an unstable and unsustainable system, which may imperil not only our ability to grow the green workforce to hit sustainability targets, but ultimately ruin our environment and our quality of life. So who is it that I'm talking about when I say the nature workforce? So I'm referring to people who participate in activities which involve spending in nature, whilst contributing to nature recovery in a formal capacity, both paid and unpaid. So talk to many people who are in the nature workforce, and you'll often hear about eco-anxiety, volunteer dependence, job instability, pay, and burnout. So how can we provide people with tasks valuable when the workforce carrying out that work is not properly supported? Now, the paid part is fairly self-explanatory, you know, about land managers, ecologists, conservation researchers, etc. But why include and specify unpaid and voluntary workers as well? So I wonder, I probably can't see the chat now, but it'll be interesting to look afterwards, or it might be better as a reaction, if you can put up a reaction. Who in the audience today has been a volunteer before? Or alternatively, who has worked with volunteers or currently works with volunteers? I'd hazard a guess that the vast majority, if not all, of the audience would say that they have been involved as a volunteer or with volunteers. And volunteering is a significant part of the conservation sector. JNC states that volunteering for conservation charities is critical to the successful delivery of many of the objectives of the country's biodiversity and environmental strategies. The 2030 agenda recognises that traditional means of implementation need to be complemented by additions, and volunteer groups comprise a crucial part of the conservation workforce in the UK, with over 90% of environmental or eco projects involving unpaid volunteers in contributory data gathering. So surely they're a part of the plan to help grow the nature workforce as part of the green transition, right? Well, it doesn't really seem like it. So although there are, of course, government plans to work towards a just green transition, they usually end up talking about green skills training, very often in the energy sector for retrofitting for sustainable transport, but quite seldom is there talk of the nature workforce, environment and ecology skills. There's very limited mention of any existing or future dependence on volunteer-based conservation when looking at key environmental reports. So if we search for the term volunteer in key reports that I've listed here, these are the only mentions that I've found. In that top row, no mention. So that's the net zero, build back better, 10-point plan, no mentions of volunteers. The People's Plan for Nature does once mention encouraging walking meetings and volunteering in green and nature-based activities. And there's a few brief mentions you can see there in the 25-year environment plan and the Green Jobs Task Force report. But it's interesting that they don't really quantify volunteers in the same way that, for example, end-of-year reports by charities quantify and value their volunteers. So it seems like the nature workforce and its volunteers are understudied and undervalued. And this is why part of my research is looking at the nature workforce as part of the sustainable governance system. So this is the basic structure of my thesis, the first two chapters, Introduction and Lit Review. And today I'll mainly focus on my chapter 3 and 4, which is about mapping, basically mapping the UK's nature workforce. So I'm going to be using, I have used job advert data from the conservation careers alongside recent studies which outline the sector's labour shortages, skills gaps and lack of diversity. And then my work investigates the motivations and barriers to participation in nature recovery, both as paid employees and as volunteers. What maintains their resilience in the face of difficult working conditions. And then in the next year or so, I'll also be working with Natural England more closely to assess how nature performance reporting can impact on motivation to act pro-environmentally, and look at what we can learn from case studies of political communities in the UK and abroad, which perform well in balancing nature and sustainability with people's health and well-being. So in order to map the UK's nature workforce, I gained access to the archives of Conservation Careers, which is the largest conservation job board in the UK. And I scraped the job adverts to collect job title, location, career stage, and salary to use as a proxy to try and map what the conservation sector looks like across the UK and over the last decade. Now, there are obvious limitations here. So since not all jobs in the sector are necessarily posted online or on conservation careers specifically, they can also be posted on job boards. But to our knowledge, this is one of the biggest data sets of its kind, so should provide some insights into the conservation sector more widely. Now, I was looking to answer questions like, how has the number of conservation jobs changed over the last decade? What is the average salary for these jobs? What sectors offer the most jobs and in what career stage? I tested over 64,000 international job adverts, of which almost 20,000 were in the UK, and these made up my final data set. And of those, it's interesting to note that just under 4,000 actually disclosed a salary. Now, the results are largely descriptive, so I'll cover just a few of the main points, but they're still at a preliminary stage and to be confirmed with the founder of Conservation Careers. So I would ask that these please not be shared at this point. But you can see in this first graph, you can see the number of jobs posted per year since 2014, and they are growing. So I've split them also by career stage. Now, obviously, the first few years as the website establishes itself may not be truly reflective of the conservation sector itself, more so of the website and how it's growing. So if we consider these first 3 years as outliers, the average growth rate from 2017 onwards per year in number of jobs was by 17.7%. So if this is reflective of the wider conservation sector, I wonder if continued, would this be enough to meet 2030 and 2050 targets? And it's also interesting to note, for example, you can see a dip in 2020 from the COVID-19 and the bounce back as well in 2021. I've also distinguished the career stages here, so volunteer and interns in blue at the top, career switches in purple, and then early career in minty green, mid-career in orange, and senior career in lilac at the bottom. And I was shocked actually to see how few volunteer positions showed up. Obviously, based on my anecdotally and also on my reading, I was expecting less, far more volunteer positions being offered. So that's something we look into a little bit further. You know, it's also possible that might not mention there are many positions which are advertised as jobs, but 4 out of 5 of those didn't advertise. It's possible that some of those early career jobs might actually be positions. If we look at what types of jobs are being advertised and by who, you can see here that the proportion sectors in each career stage. So whether the job categorized as voluntary first in this first column, career switcher in the second, early career, mid-career, and then at senior career level. And you can hear that the majority of jobs, over 62%, are within the charity sector, with just over 10% in the public sector and 16% in the private sector. And this has significance in terms of funding availability and the support and regulation for internships, for example. Now, it's interesting to note as well that senior jobs have proportionally more jobs that become available in the private sector compared to very few private jobs for volunteers and interns and career switchers. Now, this is something that we sometimes have in terms of the private sector poaching senior level employees from the public sector. But it's interesting again that the charity sector dominates all stages. Now I can also
Sophie, sorry to interrupt, but I wonder, we're getting a little bit of dropout on the on your voice, so I wonder whether if you turned your camera off, it might help with your signal.
Yeah, like that.
Thanks. Let's give it a go.
There we go. Does that help at all? Hopefully that might be a little bit clearer. It's Cornish Wi-Fi.
That sounds good.
Oh, okay, brilliant. So let me see where I was at. Yeah. So also split the jobs here by UK regions. Fortunately, that first map doesn't seem to be showing up, but you can see in the table here, when ordered by count of jobs which are posted per region, the east of England actually has the most job postings, followed by the southeast and the southwest. The map on the right was intended to show the regions as darker, the more jobs that were posted there, but you can see the order anyway in the table next to it. And I've also included average salary by region. So the green cells indicate the higher salaries and the reds indicate lower salaries. And the salaries seem to be higher on average for jobs in the south compared to the north. Now, obviously, that's slightly skewed by London, but it's true widely for the rest of the regions as well. And I think it's otherwise interesting to note that there's this kind of north-south divide in number of jobs, but also salaries. And I plan to compare these more closely to the average salaries of the regions for all jobs. There you go. There's the salary map there. And speakers, as I mentioned earlier, it's surprising that less than 1 in 5 jobs of the 1 in 5 of the adverts actually disclose the salary, which seems to suggest that employers maybe don't think that the salary will actually attract candidates. For anyone unfamiliar with box plots, this shows the data distribution. So the line in the middle of the box is the median. The box itself indicates the spread of 50% of the data around that median, and the dots indicate the outliers. Now, the values displayed here are calculated full-time equivalent yearly salaries. So if these were part-time or temporary, these were multiplied out to be a full-time yearly salary. And that calculated average overall was £31,993. And that's actually £3,000 less than the national median salary reported by ONS last year. So this is after accounting for inflation each year. So it's interesting to note that on average, there has been a decrease of 0.9% in salary in years. So to be clear, the average salary is not just stagnant, this data suggests it's actually falling. So you could say that the average job posted in the conservation sector in the UK on this job board is likely to be in the charity sector, an early career stage, probably in the east, southeast, or southwest of England, in a project manager titled role. Despite being early career, we find that project manager comes up very often, and most likely without a posted salary. But with these, if the salary is shared, it's likely to be about £20,500 full-time equivalent. So this doesn't exactly paint the conservation sector as a very attractive or stable choice. And this needs to be addressed if we expect the nature workforce to grow to meet ambitious targets. So having set the context for the nature workforce in the UK, I wanted to then dive into the motivations and barriers which affect formal participatory recovery. And by formal here, I mean recorded within the context of an organisation. So this doesn't include, for example, choosing to plant endangered native trees or plants in your own garden, unless it's part of a recorded scheme of some sort by an organisation. So if the pay is low or unpaid, with reported poor job stability, why do people join the nature workforce? And what are the barriers that may prevent others from participating? Now, I'd like to ask everyone in the audience to put in why you think people choose to participate in nature recovery. I promise it's not a trick question. I think there are some fairly easy-going answers there. But environmental psychology theory exists to explain the initiation of private sphere pro-environmental behaviours. So things like recycling habits, reducing your heating settings, or cycling to work. But they're seldom applied to understand long-term maintenance of behaviours and more difficult environmental activism behaviours. So taking aspects of theories like theory of planned behaviour, ABC theory, and value belief norm theory, along with concepts from behaviour maintenance and labour economics theories, I propose an integrated model to explain maintained participation in high-cost pro-environmental behaviours, such as participation in nature recovery. So here is the resulting integrated model. And don't worry, we've only got about 2 slides left, and I'll break it down as I go through it. So the model begins with the reception of information. There are different types of information which are important. So not only understanding the environmental issues themselves, which is systemic knowledge, but how to act to solve them, action related, and how effective these actions are, effectiveness. Information is then filtered by the effects of values and beliefs, and this then feeds into your attitudinal variables. So this is largely covered by the value, belief, norm theory, where values have been shown to impact on beliefs, with each value orientation, be it egocentric, altruistic, or biospheric, having distinct and independent influences on intentions. Your beliefs then include the new ecological paradigm, NEP, which incorporates informed environmental concern, but also awareness of behavioral consequences and ascription of responsibility. So I value the environment, I understand that my behavior has consequences on the environment, and I ascribe responsibility to myself to act in its favor. And these intention to act environmentally, and the intentions then impact on personal norms for pro-environmental behavior. So attitudinal variables covered by value, belief, norm theory, as I said. This is where we have a gap understanding between action and actual behavior. So what is it that motivates maintained behavior in the face of difficult conditions? What drives that resilience? And what are the barriers which necessitate that resilience? This is where we get to the external variables. So these can include personal capabilities, for example, training in environmental field ID skills, or ability to drive, or physical health. It also includes context, so time constraints and conflicting responsibilities, and habits as well. Does this clash or align with existing habits? If the external variables create an unsupportive environment, this can widen the gap between intention and behavior, making the behavior much more difficult despite even the strongest intentions. And this is described to some capacity by ABC theory, but here we actually combine it with the more established VBN theory. And as I say this, it might sound pretty intuitive, but it's something that hasn't really been studied or put to paper, at least in this context. And this is where we get to the feedback goal. So the pro-environmental behavior and the maintenance cycle itself. If the pro-environmental behavior occurs, in this case, participation in nature recovery activity, this can have either positive or negative influences on future behavior. And that's what creates that behavior maintenance cycle. So if successful, pro-environmental behavior completion might increase understanding of the acting individual, can feed to that warm glow sense of positivity from aligning your behavior with values and beliefs, and increasing personal skills and capability to repeat that behavior and feed into the behavior becoming more habitual. On the other hand, if the pro-environmental behavior was a negative experience, this might actually challenge the individual's understanding and their values and require self-regulation and use up limited resources to discourage the individual from repeating that behavior. And it's rarely going to be where it's all positive or negative experience. But what's important is finding a healthy balance between attitudinal and external variables, such that the individual is not, for example, purely driven by a positive attitude, but poorly supported, and ends up with burnout. So I'm now in the process of developing a questionnaire to test these ideas. So any feedback, suggestions, or advice is very welcome at this stage. I can still see a little sign popping up there that my connection's unstable, so I hope you can still hear me. And this is my final slide. So I'll end with some of these predictions. Now, it's fair to assume logically that people who choose to work to protect the environment know about environmental issues, care about them, and want to do something about them. And this has been established through value, belief, norm theory, and intention building. But this grid kind of goes about explaining that individuals with very negative attitudinal variables, for example, no belief in environmental degradation, will not act pro-environmentally unless the external variables make it easier than the alternative. So let's say, for example, no mow May, which requires less effort by asking them not to mow the lawns at all, although this still doesn't mean 100% compliance. On the other hand, individuals with very positive attitudinal variables, for example, a climate change activist, will act pro-environmentally even if the external variables make that behavior very difficult. Let's say, for example, volunteering every Sunday to plant trees. And that means you've got this middle ground here where individuals with positive or negative attitudinal variables can be more easily influenced by external variables to act pro-environmentally. And so that's where you've got no pro-environmental behavior, easy pro-environmental behavior versus hard or difficult pro-environmental behaviors. And finally, coming at the I think we're likely to see some of the following predictions of maintenance. So the nature workforce exhibits external variables of support, which is more pronounced for volunteers than employees, and depends on stronger attitudinal variables for maintenance. I predict that an imbalance between attitudinal variables and external variables results in burnout. So the maintenance cycle is then weakened by detrimental external conditions, and that rely on strong attitudinal variables to maintain that behavior. So this means we can't just lean on people being passionate. I also expect there to be a tipping point where too much imbalance leads to individuals actually leaving the environmental sector to seek employment in a sector which provides more support. And finally, positive experiences of pro-environmental behavior can actually strengthen the behavior maintenance cycle. So to enable this behavior change, we have to remove those barriers. We have to provide opportunity and support. So as the authors of Nudge would say, make it easy. We should be considering not only how we can build a greener future, but also who will build a greener future, and turn our attention to supporting the next generation to live in harmony with our natural environments. As I mentioned, my next stages are to finish developing my questionnaire and test this model and these predictions, to run a series of interviews, also talking to nature workers about these topics. So any feedback, suggestions, questions, I'm open to. And if I may, I saw someone else finish the presentation like this, and I quite liked it. So there are some book recommendations if any of these topics have struck a chord with you and you'd like to learn more. Wild Service by Nick Hay and John Moses is a right to roam call to action about the importance of human connection and access to nature. Losing Eden by Lucy Jones is brilliant. It's about mental health benefits and of positive human nature experiences. Braiding Sweetgrass, I'm currently still reading, and that explores Indigenous wisdom and scientific knowledge of plants, which I'm currently still reading through. And finally, Humankind is a Hopeful History by Rutger Bregman, and it's one of my favorites. It's fascinating, and it's got a really refreshingly optimistic perspective of human behavior and society. So if you'd like to get in touch about my work, please feel free to email me or add me on LinkedIn, and I'd be happy to keep the conversation going and address any questions.
Well, that's brilliant. Thanks very much, Sophie. Lots of food for thought there. I think we'll start off with a question from me, if I can.
Absolutely.
I'd like to ask, do you think that volunteering might have contributed to the lack of diversity that we see in the ecological sector? Because obviously only certain groups of people have the luxury to be able to volunteer their time. They may be supported by parents, or they may have independent means of looking after themselves while they do that. Do you think that's been part of that issue?
Absolutely. I think there's been such an attitude of kind of, if people are passionate enough and people will do it for free because they care about it. And then, sorry, I hope you can hear me still.
Yeah.
So you get that sense of people, if people want to do it for free, then surely that's fine. But like you said, there's this then sector effects where as you mentioned, unless you have that financial backing and you have that opportunity because maybe you have family supporting you, or you don't have those other kind of responsibilities of childcare, for example, then you have much more opportunity to go out and do those volunteering experiences. And that's very commonly asked for in the sector. When you're applying for jobs, people expect you to have experience. People expect people to pay for their own training, for certain qualifications, and gain that experience even by paying for it. And I think that hugely feeds back into the lack of diversity. And that's a big issue that we need to address.
Yeah, I think so. I think there's a danger if we continue to rely on people gaining experience through volunteering, that we'll just perpetuate that lack of diversity that we see.
Yeah,
I'm going to turn to the chat. There's a comment here from Juliet. As there aren't many people in the meeting, Juliet, would you like to expand on the statement that you made in the chat?
Yeah, well, first of all, that was such an interesting presentation. I really enjoyed it. And I think that what I said was kind of similar to what Sophie was saying at the end, in a way. But yeah, it feels like in this sector, the only driving force in staying in this sector would be a desire to make positive change. Like all the other variables are against you staying in this work long time, including salaries and opportunities and things like you mentioned, like being able to drive, having the time, able to take a part-time role that has much lower salary. So it was so satisfying to see that research kind of backs up kind of what we might expect, which was really cool. And yeah, I think it's really interesting, and I think that there needs to be a big push with like a campaign to try and improve it for the next generation. So I feel inspired.
Excellent.
Thanks, Juliet. Yeah, I think it's hard because when I talk to people about this topic, and they very quickly go, what's the answer? And there's so many things. And I recently went to a talk in Bruges from the IUCN Regional Conservation Forum, where it was mentioned that we need a multitude of solutions. There's not going to be kind of a single, silver bullet solution that will fix all of these things. It's so complex. There's so many overlying, areas to study and things that can be done. And we need to have a huge variety of solutions to try and address these issues, and we need to pick from a lot of those and apply a lot of those solutions. Yeah.
I mean, my sort of take home from your model was it looked like improving those external variables is the key really to maintaining pro-environmental behavior in people. So, I mean, do you have a sense of some sort of simple examples of how one might start to do that? You've said obviously there's not a single answer, is there? But there might be a myriad of different things that we could do. Could you tell us a little bit about a couple of those?
Yeah, I mean, one big thing that was briefly mentioned and that Juliet picked up on as well is, about driver's licenses and accessibility to green spaces. I think if that's something that is more acknowledged, that it's kind of exclusionary to expect people to be able to provide their own transport to these spaces, that, if we then address that in terms of providing more public transport, or if projects are to provide transport to these to those green spaces, that will probably open up those opportunities to a lot of far more people. And there's also, it's great that there are so many people that have those attitudinal variables that are already involved and that need more external variables support to make to remove those barriers and to make those career choices more attractive to people to stay in and to go for in the first place. But it's also possible to fit that model into, you know, feeding back on educational programs. You know, we take into account how that is fed through people's values and beliefs, and that's something that comes through at a very young age and through the education system, which, you know, really need to feed those things to bear in mind, so that, you know, we can't expect people who don't care about the environment to be going into jobs which are unstable and poorly paid and poorly externally supported, when it's so hard for people that be passionate about it doing those things.
Yeah. So I'm just going to go back to the chat. I can again, I can see that Tanavi Kumar has made a has written something down here. Tanavi, would you like to expand on your comment in the chat? Or not?
I can see I don't mind reading out that if that works for everyone.
Well,
So
your eyesight's better than mine, Sophie, so thanks for that.
she's put, I think the need for volunteering for even entry-level jobs makes this worse. People want to hire people that have those field skills and not have to train them necessarily. In my experience, about the lack of diversity ethnically is that also a lot of starter jobs require car accessibility to reach reserves. Absolutely. And it's interesting, you know, through this analysis I've done of the job adverts, conservation careers are very, very involved in providing as many opportunities and training opportunities and putting people in touch with people and trying to open sector. And as part of that, they've done some analyses of what is required as part of these jobs. And it's interesting that they note that many people ask whether you need a master's degree to get into these kind of jobs. And they've actually found that no, you don't need a master's degree. But 100% of the jobs they found asked for experience. So bearing in mind that the vast majority of these jobs are early career, and, you know, I think it'd be even more interesting to be able to put that into entry level, like really first job in this sector kind of level. They all expect experience. And how can everyone have experience, you know? And it's been pointed out even, so like I said, from the SIEM released a report in 2023, pointing out that there was an issue with skills gaps in ecology graduates. So they found that ecology graduates were being taken into jobs, but they didn't have certain skills, particularly for ID, species ID stuff. That they found that universities weren't feeding back into that. So I think there's an interesting gap there between what's coming through in the degrees. And in my university currently, I'm also a PTA, so I've now been involved in some courses, and I've seen more ID skills coming up in additional courses that people can do. But yeah, there's a lot there that needs to be adjusted, and I think it needs to be looked at holistically to say, okay, here's what we need for, you know, the environment sector, for ecology sector. Further down the line, how are we going to feed that into the education system? How we feed that into, you know, university courses? And how can we also provide vocational pathways for career switchers and people to bring their skills from other jobs into the conservation sector and make it more accessible?
Yeah, that ID skills gap is certainly something that's that I've seen in the ecology profession. Yeah. Debbie, you made a comment in the chat about salaries.
Yes, I'd also make a comment about teaching of ID skills. You know, I've recently stopped running an MSc program, and actually you can't teach students ID skills fit for the workplace. You can teach them how to acquire those skills, but they have to go out and practice it for themselves. So unless there's that individual motivation, you won't get those skills. Even if you're running programs where you're doing an ID test once a week, you still won't get someone up to the standard they need to be for the workplace. They have to do it themselves. So, sorry, that comes back to your motivation. But I've argued for a long time that the reason for the lack of diversity is entirely to do with the salaries. And also the fact this car ownership, many job adverts require people to be car drivers and have their own car. Perhaps not, perhaps a bit more pool cars now. But my students who, British Bangladeshis and people of Caribbean origin coming from London and inner city areas, why would they ever have learnt to drive? It's incredibly expensive and all of that. So they come out of university with a really large student debt for a start, which they're expected to service off these very low salaries. And I've suggested in meetings about lack of diversity that actually providing bursaries for driving lessons would be a really positive way of increasing diversity. But of course, people just laugh because nobody wants to hear that. They want to hear that there's some magic bullet. But the second part of my comment was about the fact that there seems to be a huge number of early career ecologists wanting jobs. But it's almost impossible, anecdotally reported, to recruit senior or principals. I don't know if you found that at RSK, Des?
Yeah, it's certainly a challenge.
Came out of your data.
Yeah.
Sorry,
so senior level jobs being offered. It's interesting though that so because it's job advert data, I don't have any information on how many people applied, for example. There's particularly, it was notable that there are more senior level jobs being offered in the private sector than there are in the charity or public sectors. And I suspect that is to do with salary and how much they can offer. So that was a particular kind of jump from one career stage to the next. As soon as your senior career stage, it suddenly jumps to more so in the private sector. But I think, yeah, I mean, it made me think as well, your comment about providing like a bursary to allow students to be able to get those kind of skills. I think my cohort through university, and this is a very particular situation, but through our masters, because through COVID, part of our the costs for our master's course were actually changed into a bursary because we weren't able to do the field course, which we were originally supposed to go on. And that meant that after our year of master's course, we were provided with a sum of money which we could put towards training, which, as long as we argued that it would go towards our careers in ecology or environmental or conservation work, that would be covered by that bursary. And that was actually really interesting to then see what people went and did with that, because some people did have to then use that towards, driving lessons or towards getting a car, which they needed for those jobs that they were applying for. And, I don't imagine that will become a norm by any means for any master's courses. But it was kind of interesting that came out of our COVID experience. And was definitely very helpful for people anecdotally from speaking to my cohort in getting those jobs afterwards.
Yeah, absolutely, and there's some support for this idea of the importance of a driving license from James C in the chat. I see. I was going to ask another question, which is from a slightly different perspective, which is your last slide where you showed sort of a spectrum of from negative to positive attitudes towards pro-environmental behaviours. You talked about a group of people who have very negative views about pro-environmental behaviour, but said that if you made life really easy for them, made the changes really easy for them, they might actually do some things. What do you think is driving those very, very negative attitudes? I mean, you mentioned also that that they may not believe that there is, you know, in the extent of environmental degradation that's going on. Surely there can't be many people who, I mean, I'm a bit biased, obviously, but there can't be many people who truly have not been bombarded with some information about the level of environmental degradation. So what's driving their continued negative perceptions?
So something that you hear about very often is this idea of campaigns to increase awareness about climate change and the environment and environmental issues. And I think that follows this kind of knowledge deficit model, which assumes that people don't care because they don't know. But actually, studies that have gone more into have found that providing the information alone doesn't make people care or make people act. And realistically, you know, people in their day-to-day lives that live in the city might have other priorities which sit above, you know, the values of, you know, having that connection with nature. It might not be something they've grown up with. It might not be something they experience on a day-to-day basis. And so that maybe doesn't fit into or isn't parallel with their values. They may discard it for something that is more of a priority at that time. So if someone who doesn't, you know, happen to value the environment in that way for whatever reason, is given the option between a pro-environmental option, which is more expensive, and a environmentally damaging option, which is less expensive, they are likely to go with the less expensive option, particularly if the focus on their minds is, you know, the cost of living crisis, for example. Whereas what that kind of grid of spectrums is trying to get at, and which I hope might be the case, is if we provide options which are actually easier than the alternative, then even people that don't care whether it's pro-environmental or not, if it's cheap, it's cheaper. That still fits their priorities. So again, it's about providing this many options for people to choose and making it as easy as possible. And sometimes I think in policy design, some of it, you know, it can be assumed that you have to go to great lengths to make those adjustments. And actually, that's not necessarily the case. And again, you know, looking at it, I sort of think this stuff seems really intuitive. Of course, people that care would be doing more and people that don't care will be doing less and so on. But it's these kind of things that it's like we have to get it on paper to quantify it, to put it across and hopefully have that impact on policy eventually.
Yeah. Well, I like to think that things are moving in that direction and that we are linking environmental benefits to the everyday challenges of people more and more successfully over time. Are there any other questions from the chat? Annie, I see you mentioned, these challenges that people will have in doing the right thing environmentally because of other pressures on them. Debbie, you've put something else in there?
I have just a comment about how many people leave. I've had people with very good field skills who have actually left after a few years working in the profession and gone to, in some cases, going back to supermarket work that they did while they were doing their degree. It pays so much better. And particularly on seasonal work, you know, bat work can be seasonal, botanical work can be seasonal, and 0 hours contracts, being laid off, instability. Once they get to thinking, well, they want to start a family or buy a house or anything like that, it's actually just not viable. But in many cases, they carry on, you know, volunteering They're very highly motivated. But it would be really interesting to quantify that. But just going back to this wages issue, I think it's pretty scandalous, really. We call ourselves a profession, and we're just not paying people professional wages in many cases. But Sophie, I just have to ask you, you did mention that you didn't want some figures to be shared.
Oh,
We've recorded this.
Oh, that's totally fine. I just meant in terms of being kind of replicated and kind of shared context of the rest of the talk, basically.
Well, if we put this recording up on the YouTube channel, we have no control over what people do with it.
That's totally as long as it's put up there with the whole context of the talk. So if viewers end up screenshotting, then that's beyond our control, really, isn't it?
Okay, I just thought I'd better ask.
Yeah, no
Back to
worries.
you, Des.
Thanks, Debbie. Okay, well, we've reached the top of the hour, so I think it's time to draw things to a conclusion. Thanks so much, Sophie. It's been really thought-provoking. There's lots in there that should inspire us to try and challenge the way things are done at the moment. So thanks very much for bringing all that to our attention. And thank you, all of you out there who've listened today. We appreciate your support. You'll see from the slide in front of you that we have another event on the 21st of November, when Debbie, who you've heard today, and Brian Heppenstall from SAIM will be talking about ecology apprenticeships. So please join us if you can at 6 o'clock on the 21st of November for that event. So we're now going to go off and have our committee meeting and bid you all a good night. Thanks for being with us. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye.
And I'm going to stop recording.